Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida Fair Tax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, July 18th, 2025. This week's Chairman's Report is guest written by Jade Wally. Jade's a practicing CPA who has been on the Americans for Fair Taxation Board of Directors. The Fair Tax and Reconciliation, how would it play out in Congress? The Fair Tax Act, H.R. 25, was first introduced into Congress in 1999. However, we very rarely discuss what would happen if the Fair Tax Act made it out of the House Ways and Means Committee and onto the House floor for a full vote, and how the bill would advance in the Senate. The congressional concept of reconciliation has been in recent headlines as Congress attempts to pass the big beautiful bill. Now, if fair tax were the legislation being considered, would reconciliation even be a consideration? Well, first, let's examine a brief history of this unique political construct. The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 created a congressional budget process and provided the special reconciliation rules with a primary goal of facilitating Senate consideration of deficit-reducing legislation. Now, this process begins with a budget resolution that instructs House committees regarding spending and income, which must first be passed by the House. Now, in April of 2025, the House passed the previously approved Senate budget blueprint, which outlines spending for the federal government for the next 10 years. The measure calls for significant tax cuts, an increase in spending for immigration enforcement, an expansion of the Pentagon, as well as unspecified spending cuts and a $5 trillion debt limit increase. Now, more specifically, the plan allows up to $5.3 trillion in tax cuts over the next decade. It will extend the 2017 tax cuts that President Trump signed into law with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and provide for an additional $1.5 trillion in new tax cuts, talking about no tax on tips, overtime, Social Security, etc. Now, the budget resolution also directs both chambers to slash the deficit through spending cuts, with the Senate setting a minimum of just $4 billion for the next decade, with the House calling for $1.5 trillion in cuts over the same period. Now, fitting a budget reconciliation bill within these targets set out in the budget resolution can be cumbersome. If the bill's spending, net of new revenue, exceeds the previously established targets, revenue offsets are then required, all while satisfying reconciliation rules that include not changing revenues during a fiscal year after that year is covered by the reconciliation bill, unless the provision's title as a whole remains budget neutral. Did your eyes just roll in the back of your head? Well. These detailed requirements can force inclusion of sunsets of the type that set up the 2010 fiscal cliff of Bush tax cuts and that caused the individual provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to expire after 2025, if not permanently extended with the passage of the big beautiful bill. While avoiding the intricacies and minutiae of this process, and yes, there are quite a bit more, there are certain reconciliation restrictions referred to as the Byrd Rule, named for the late Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, that Congress must adhere to. Any provisions deemed extraneous are removed from the bill, but consideration of the remainder of the legislation may continue. Now, many of the conditions applicable to use the budget reconciliation, including determining which items included in the legislation violate the Byrd Rule, require consultation with the Senate parliamentarian. Now, we've seen the parliamentarian discussed more in June of 2025 than I can ever recall. Now, while all this is certainly informative, what about the fair tax? Well, while certainly subject to debate that I hope we'll soon get the chance to explore, the fair tax would not require the unwieldy and burdensome process outlined above. So why would this be the case with the fair tax? When the Congressional Budget Office scores proposed legislation, the CBO has the requirement, or at least the flexibility, depending on each House session's established rules, to use dynamic rather than static scoring of proposed legislation in determining if the previously established budget resolution targets are met. This means that the fair tax, which was painstakingly crafted to be revenue neutral to the U.S. Treasury, would not increase the deficit by a single penny. In fact, with dynamic scoring, inclusive of conservative future economic growth assumptions that the fair tax has been shown to promote, drastically reduced illegal tax evasion, and some other ancillary benefits, the fair tax would show a net reduction to our ever-increasing national debt and annual budget deficits. So what does all this mean? When the fair tax passes the House, it would then only require a simple majority in the Senate to go to the president's desk for signature. All the back and forth with the CBO and the Senate parliamentarian on the effect of various provisions would all be non-existent. The fair tax does it again. Even in its legislative approval process, the fair tax is strikingly more efficient than the outdated and abusive IRS and the current income payroll tax system. So what are we waiting for? In conclusion, Jade has done an excellent job of explaining the path that will be followed to enact the fair tax and improve the U.S. economy and the lives of all Americans. Now, many of you have labored tirelessly for freedom from the federal income tax and the IRS. You deserve a great deal of credit for your efforts to educate the American people on the need to fund the American government in a way that's good for America and that returns freedom to the American people. It's imperative, though, that we don't replace the current income tax and the IRS with an alternative system that can still be manipulated by the ruling elite. We must let Congress and the President know that the best way to replace the income tax and the IRS is with the fair tax. Now, make no mistake about it. The fair tax is a grave threat to the ruling elites. It will strip them of their power and their ability to control us through the tax system. Their opposition to the fair tax will be fierce and unrelenting, and don't think for an instant they won't use half-truths, deception, and downright lies in their desperate attempt to hang on to their power. However, with the support of this president, we can finally eliminate the income tax and the IRS. Now, of course, the best course of action is not only to repeal the income tax and abolish the IRS, but to repeal the 16th Amendment as well, so that no future administration can ever shackle the American people with an income tax again. We must come together and ensure that real tax reform, the fair tax, is not subverted by the elites in D.C. This will take the diligent efforts from all of us. We need your financial assistance, and we need your grassroots assistance. Now, if you have contacts that will allow us to get more information about the fair tax to President Trump, please let us know. Also, please email us at info@fairtax.org, and we'll give you some options on how you can best help us. At a minimum, please call your congressional representative and ask if he or she supports the fair tax. If so, thank him or her for their support and suggest they become a co-sponsor of H.R. 25 if they're not one already. If not, ask why not. Now, if your representative claims to be unfamiliar with the fair tax, offer to have someone come to their office and explain it to them. The solution: pass the fair tax. Now, why would D.C. pass the fair tax and give up an almost unlimited source of donations? Well, they won't, at least not voluntarily. The only way they will is if the rest of us demand it. Isn't it time to end this ludicrous tax collection system and the IRS along with it? Help bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing, or actually investing, $10.40 a month, you help provide a financial base to Americans for fair taxation. Now, if you can make larger contributions/investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to fairtax.org to invest in AFFT and help us pass the fair tax. It's an investment in your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at fairtax.org.